Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion to exchange on the inaugural green loan, first ever CBI certified in the shipping industry, raised recently by KiwiRail in New Zealand. I'm Yasmin Jedai, and I head the Sustainable Finance team for Asia Pacific at Société Générale. And I'm very pleased to welcome today three panelists for our discussion. We have Michelle Main, Sustainability Manager at KiwiRail. Brian Robertson, Senior Certification Manager at the Climate Bond Initiative, CBI, and Gwenaëlle Delattre, our Regional Head for LNG and Offshore Shipping for Asia Pacific at Société Générale. So I suggest we start the discussion by presenting KiwiRail, its activities, its sustainability strategy, and how this fits within New Zealand overall transition and decarbonization journey, as well as the shipping industry decarbonization pathway. As understanding the company, its operations, and the industry where it operates are prerequisite for any sustainable financing solution. So Michelle, I leave you the floor so that you can present the company.
Great, thanks, Yasmin. So KiwiRail is a state-owned enterprise operating throughout New Zealand. We move freight and people by rail and ship. We play a critical role in New Zealand's transport sector. Our purpose is stronger connections, better New Zealand. And our ferries are a critical part of that connection, providing freight and supply chain logistics for the country. As shown on this map, the ferries known as the Interislander, connect our North and South Islands across the Cook Strait. They link the road and rail networks via the ports in Wellington and Picton. Next slide, please. In a typical year, KiwiRail's trains and ferries transport more than 18 million tonnes of freight, enabled 28 million low-carbon commuter journeys, and prior to COVID, moved around 1 million tourists. In terms of freight, this equates to approximately 12% of New Zealand's freight task and 25% of New Zealand's total freight exports. Through our activities, the value of rail created by KiwiRail and provided to New Zealand's economy is estimated to be between $1.7 and $2.14 billion. Next slide. The value of rail is created by determining what the effect on the road network would be if the rail network didn't exist. For example, how many additional trucks would be required if we were to remove the rail network, and what would the implications of that be? The value of rail is calculated by 6 key areas, and they are through reduced congestion in our cities, reduced air pollution and fuel use, fewer GHG emissions, reduced road maintenance costs, and finally, improve safety outcomes through a reduction in our road injuries and fatalities. Further to that, KiwiRail also provides employment and career opportunities for our 4,200 strong team. It also provides flow-on opportunities to many businesses throughout the country. Next slide. As mentioned, as KiwiRail is operating throughout the country, we have a desire to minimise the impacts of our operations and to help grow the prosperity of the country. On screen is a screenshot from our sustainability strategy, and you can see it's based on the 3 key pillars of environment, society, and economy. And we've got a series of targets and activities that fit within each of these columns. We recognise the impacts of our operations and embrace the role that we can play in advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or UN SDGs. As such, each of our 3 pillars of our strategy is underpinned by one of the UN SDGs. Our environment pillar is underpinned by SDG 13, or climate action, and this is where our new Interislander ferries will support through their reduction in emissions. Through our other business activities, we also support the advancement of SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So on, we've got an image of our carbon footprint. Last year, KiwiRail emitted approximately 232,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent through our Scope 1 and 2 emissions. As you can see, 93% of these emissions came from our rail and ferry fleet alone, and that's because they're currently reliant on fossil fuels. 7%, or the remaining part of our footprint, came from activities outside of these two main fleets, and that includes things like our passenger vehicle fleet and electricity usage by our facilities. As a business, we've committed to two key carbon reduction targets, and they are a 30% reduction by 2030 to align with New Zealand's commitment to the Paris Agreement, and to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which aligns with New Zealand's Zero Carbon Act that was passed into law in 2019. In New Zealand, transport emissions make up about 20% of our country's footprint, with the majority of those coming from heavy road freight or the roading sector. Less than 1.8% of our emissions come from rail. Importantly, every ton of freight shifted by rail produces 70% fewer emissions than every ton of freight shifted by road. So we've got a really important role to play in transitioning New Zealand's economy to a low emissions future. In addition to the new ferries, KiwiRail is also investigating how to transition its locomotive fleet in line with its carbon reduction targets. The solutions for a low carbon rail system, they're likely to be a mix of some further network electrification, battery hybrid technology, and other new energy systems. So it's a space that we continue to investigate and monitor closely. In addition, we continue an ongoing focus in improving our fuel efficiency across our locomotive fleets.
Thank you, Michelle. So Gwenaëlle, Michelle was mentioning the ambition of New Zealand in terms of decarbonization. I think it will be great to have also a view on how the shipping industry is evolving. What are your views? What do you see on the market in terms of solutions, transition pathways, but also what the other players are doing in that space?
Thanks, Yasmin. What we see is really a growing pressure from many stakeholders in society, governments, and so on to decarbonize the shipping industry. I mean, putting things in perspective, shipping accounts for about 3% of global emissions in terms of carbon dioxide, and it's still the most environmentally friendly way of transporting goods and passengers over a long distance when you use a ton-mile metric. Still, the industry understands that it has to play a part, because if the industry is left unchecked, then these emissions have the potential to grow to a much more significant level by 2050. And so therefore, you see many players coming together to try to implement solutions, or actually to try and push forward the decarbonization agenda for the industry. So you see, for instance, banks which have formed the Poseidon Principles, which is a framework under which the banks will report the climate alignment of their portfolio. You see a mirroring initiative with charterers, off-takers, ultimate clients of tonnage providers under the Sea Cargo Charter framework. You have recently witnessed the signature of the call for action for shipping decarbonization just ahead of the COP26. You have other initiatives around Getting to Zero Coalition and so on. So there are many initiatives. There's also a strong regulatory push from the International Maritime Organization, which has set targets to improve carbon efficiency with milestones by 2030 and 2050. The ultimate aim being to decrease carbon emissions by 50% by 2050. So I think all this is necessary to try to push forward the decarbonization agenda. But the key challenge really remains centered around the fact that as of today, when it comes to deep sea shipping, there is no technology or fuel solutions that meets the three key criteria to decarbonization to decarbonize the industry. And these three criteria are fuel or technology which is technically safe, commercially viable, and scalable in terms of production. As of today, there are many initiatives to explore alternative fuels and technologies, but there is none that meets all three key criteria to make it work as of today. So it creates a lot of uncertainties for owners, because owners still have to take a view when it comes to fleet renewal or investing in new assets. They have to take a view on whether their assets are actually going to be in 10, 20 years time, because their assets have very long economic lives. And I think the concept of stranded assets is particularly relevant, and every owner wants to avoid that. Owners still have to account for the potential increase in regulations. I mean, there are more and more talks about actually having to do more efforts to decarbonize the shipping industry. And of course, the last point, which is also very important, is the cost element to it. Decarbonizing vessels or using alternative fuels comes at a cost. Who pays for this? And what we want to all ensure is that the green agenda is really at the forefront of everyone's concern, but at the same time, companies need to remain profitable to make it work for them. So it's really an exciting time for the industry. We see lots of risk, but also lots of rewards for all the first movers, including, for instance, KiwiRail through this transaction. We see a lot of uncertainties, but at least what we can say is that there are two key trends which have been emerging over the past few months. And I think these are key messages for the industry. The first one is that decarbonization must be undertaken through a cooperative approach. It's not the matter only of ship owners, but also the port developers, the fuel and vessel suppliers, the shipyards, governments, off-takers. So this is something that is really important, that everyone has to come together to try to implement a cooperative approach. And I think this transaction in particular ticks that box with having a sovereign entity having this holistic approach for the whole of New Zealand. And the second message is that since owners will have to deal with uncertainties about technologies and fuels for still quite a long time, you know, we're talking about 10, 15, 20 years, it's really important to try and ensure that vessel design is flexible enough so that assets can accommodate future technologies, but also future regulatory emissions tightening. And the concept of future-proofing of investment is really important in the industry today.
Yeah, thank you, Gwenaëlle. And actually, you touched upon an important message here about climate, about collective action, and this is a must if you want to fight against global warming. So one of the most active players as well in this collective initiative is CBI, Climate Bond Initiative. So Brian, CBI has been very vocal on the shipping industry. You have published a couple of years ago some guidelines on how to assess the greenness of an investment or financing in the shipping space. Can you give us more color about your approach, but also the way?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Yasmin. So the certification scheme under the Climate Bond Standard, right now we have criteria for 15 sectors total. We have 3 sectors under development, and we're also working on transitions. Our focus, of course, right now is certification under the shipping sector criteria. As Gwenaëlle mentioned, the shipping sector, it's very significant in that it accounts for roughly 80% of global trade by volume and roughly 70% of global trade by value. And there's an estimated compound average growth rate of 3.8% for seaborne trade. Most of those emissions are carbon dioxide, but ship emissions from methane have been increasing due to use and transport of liquefied gas and associated methane slip. The good news, on the other hand, for this sector is that it can be decarbonized for the most part. How would we go about that? Well, we'd go about it 2 ways. The first is by increasing the energy efficiency of shipping. And second, by reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of the energy that ships use. Next slide, please. So when a debt issuer in the shipping sector issues debt, that issuer might have the option of getting that debt certified under the certification scheme. The major determinant is making sure that the assets that are being financed meet the criteria. Here in this slide, we see the process the issuer goes through to get its debt certified. In a nutshell, the first step, the issuer sets up a bond and identifies assets that should meet the criteria. Second step, the issuer hires a verified party who's going to give assurance that the assets do meet the criteria and the standard. Third, they submit the documents to us, the Climate Bonds Initiative Certification Desk. We review it, we issue the certification if everything checks out. Then after that, the issuer will follow up with a post-issuance verification, and then they'll issue an annual report during the lifetime of the bond. So it's quite straightforward. Next slide, please. Now, the verifier that the issuer hires is going to do two big things. The verifier is going to check the debt issuance against two major pillars. The first pillar is to make sure the debt issuance meets the criteria of the current climate bond standard. Right now, we're under version 3.0. Next slide, please. The second pillar is the verifier is going to make sure that the debt issuance meets the sector-specific criteria. The criteria for the shipping sector, it's quite straightforward. We've made a decision tree to help guide issuers and verifiers through the steps. The first question is the vessel primarily dedicated to transporting fossil fuels? If the answer is yes, it's simply a hard stop. Certification won't be possible. If, however, the vessel is not primarily dedicated to transporting fossil fuels, then we ask, is the vessel zero emissions? If it is, then it's certifiable. If it's not, then we ask, will the vessel remain under the emissions intensity threshold throughout the lifetime of the bond? Again, if yes, then we need an MRP, that's a managed reduction plan. That's simply going to show us how the vessel will remain under the emissions intensity threshold throughout its operating life. Next slide, please. And here's a simple example. It's a screenshot of emissions intensity thresholds that we've developed for the shipping industry. You can see here on the right side for the year 2050, you can see that there are zeros all the way down, and that means zero emissions by 2050, so decarbonized. Again, this is just a screenshot. We have numbers for most ship types broken down by gigatons. So that's basically how the criteria works in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And actually, I will come back to you in a few minutes so that we can dig in a little bit more on how CBI assessed this specific transaction. So maybe we can go into more details about the financing itself. Again, it was a $350 million raised recently by KiwiRail to finance two inland ferries. So Michelle, do you want to give us more color on the use of proceeds of this financing?
Sure, thank you. So our current fleet is comprised of 3 ferries, and they're really capacity constrained during the peak season, and they're nearing the end of their useful lives for the Interislander business. So really the 2 new ferries are going to be transformational in terms of our operational capacity and their environmental performance. They'll be able to carry twice as many passengers, 3 times more rail wagons, and nearly double the number of trucks and other vehicles. From their arrival in 2025 and 2026, the new ferries will reduce our carbon emissions by 40% compared to the current fleet, which equates to about 16% of KiwiRail's total carbon footprint. This will be largely achieved through their diesel-electric hybrid propulsion system, where they'll have the ability to increase the battery capacity that they operate on over the asset lifetime. The efficient hull design, as well as a number of other innovative measures, will also lead to improved environmental performance of the new fleet. In addition to reducing KiwiRail's carbon footprint, being able to accommodate more rail wagons on the ships will also encourage more freight to be moved from road to rail. So this will further support New Zealand's climate change targets and commitment to the Paris Agreement.
So Gwenaëlle, do you want to give more color on the structuring itself? In terms of how the financing has been structured, terms of the loan, security package?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, it's 350 million New Zealand dollars financing, financing both the construction and the operational phase of the ferries. In terms of tenor, it's quite long dated, also reflecting the fact that the vessels have a very long economic life. As Michelle mentioned, the existing ferries have been trading for almost 30 years. Of course, the financing is, I would say, a traditional ship finance transaction in the sense that it is secured by the mortgages over the assets. The vessels are being built in Korea and they will be delivered in 2025, 2026. Michel described the unique features of the assets themselves. So they will have a strong impact in terms of reduction in carbon emissions for KiwiRail, thanks to their battery, hybrid, and diesel electric propulsion. And they have this built-in flexibility, which allows this concept of future-proofing of the investment that we mentioned before to be fully embedded in the transaction. So this is overall quite a strategic project for New Zealand. It's really consistent with the whole New Zealand energy mix as well, which is coming for a very large part from renewable sources. And I think the whole story and the whole strategic rationale of the transaction allowed for a strong response from the bank group. We are very happy to have been selected to fund this project along with our fellow banking partners, Westpac, NAB, and Bank of America.
And on the sustainability features, maybe a few words. So again, the loan is a green loan. So just to take a step back, a green loan is a financing which use of proceeds are dedicated to a specific green asset. Obviously, the deal has been has been following the green loan principles in that way, with the 4 components: use of proceeds, process of evaluation and selections, the management of proceeds, and the reporting, which are the 4 elements for a green loan. So for the use of proceeds, again, it was to finance the ferries, and the greenness of the assets has been evaluated based on CBI standards, which was the managed reduction plan option, which means that there was a fuel switch of the ferries to ultimately use 100% battery powered in that case, and then reaching the zero emission, as mentioned previously by Brian. There was a pre-certification or pre-verification made by EY, which was in the form of a limited assurance, which was also a precondition to have a CBI certification. And again, Brian will explain a little bit more in a few seconds. And KiwiRail is committing to make an annual reporting on the allocation of the proceeds, but also on the impact of the financing. And I think this is an important feature of the green loan, as we are, again, able to assess the impact of the financing itself. As a green loan coordinator, our role was to help KiwiRail in drafting the green borrowing framework, assess if the assets would fit within the green loan criteria and would fit the CBI guidelines. So we have been liaising with EY, but also with CBI to make sure that the certification will be made in a smoother manner. So I think it's a good moment for me to pause here, and maybe Brian, you can you can hand over to explain a little bit more the way you have certified this deal and the work you have been doing with EY in that space.
Sure, certainly. Thanks, Yasmin. So this is the first certification using the Climate Bonds Initiative sector criteria for shipping. And fortunately, it went quite straightforward without any major challenges. As Yasmin mentioned, EY provided limited assurance for IREX, the Inter-Island Resilient Connection Project, and the assurance was against the Climate Bond Standard version 3, as I showed before, and the technical requirements of the shipping criteria. The conclusion was positive. The second rail-enabled diesel-electric hybrid ferry will be delivered no later than the planned delivery date, which was in 2026. And KiwiRail would replace the battery size by a minimum of at least 10 megawatt hours before the beginning of 2035. Now, the increased battery size will take the total battery capacity of each ferry to 18.5 megawatt hours, and that will ensure that the ferries remain under the carbon intensity metric. In this case, it's the annual efficiency ratio, and we'll keep it there until the facility in 2036.
Thank you, Brian. We were very proud at Société Générale to to contribute to this first ever transaction, to work with you. So hopefully it will pave the way for many other transactions. So Michelle, do you want to say a few words? We are reaching the end of our discussion. Any comment on your side?
Yeah, sure. So on screen, just to conclude, we've got a quote there from Greg Miller, KiwiRail CEO. And basically, just echoing Greg's comments, we're really delighted that KiwiRail has achieved the world's first CBI certification in the shipping sector. We feel it demonstrates our commitment to achieving our carbon reduction targets and really sets New Zealand, or our contribution to New Zealand's low emissions economy as well, on the right trajectory. We're also really excited about the green borrowing framework that we've established through this process and the opportunity to potentially add to it from our green portfolio as opportunities arise. Importantly, I think this approach paves the way and opens up exciting industry opportunities. So through the collaborative approach to achieve emission reduction goals, there's a load more opportunity to be gained through this. And I think really achieving this certification has taken a lot of work. So we'd really like to take this opportunity to acknowledge those who have been involved. So starting with the Naval Architects, OSK ShipTech, Russell McVeigh and EY, alongside our banking partners, Bank of America, National Australia Bank, Westpac New Zealand, and finally Société Générale, our Green Loan Coordinator, who have supported us to achieve this world first. So thanks from KiwiRail to each of you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much for your nice words. So thank you everyone for your time today. Very to KiwiRail, CBI, EY, and our banking partners. Again, we are very delighted to be this journey with you, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to support you in the future. So thank you everyone for your attention today, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you. Keep safe.